Bierich, it was said, was equally at home at a philosopher's roundtable and in the corporate boardroom. Bierich studied philosophy and mathematics in Hamburg and Münster, received his PhD in 1951 for a dissertation on Frege and Bertrand Russell, two giants of analytic philosophy and subjects that I never quite got to in my philosophy training. Truly esoteric and important thinkers. And then when Bierich got that degree, he promptly went into private banking. In the 1960s and 70s, he was the chief financial officer of Mannesmann, later Vodafone, and then he was the chief financial officer of Allianz, the big insurer, and eventually the CEO of Robert Bosch GmbH, with which this institution has had a close relationship for many, many years. He was also the chairman of their advisory board until his death in 2000. So Marcus Bierich was a much admired figure in Germany, and many different people combined to get together to fund this distinguished visitorship, and we're enormously grateful for that. The Marcus Bierich Distinguished Visitorship also has quite a litany of impressive people who have given this lecture. Stephen Greenblatt, Francis Fukuyama, Linda Gordon, Judith Wexler, and and Alec McGillis, who is now a fellow but has already given that last year when we were entirely or almost entirely virtual. So Pieter Judson, as I mentioned, holds the chair in 19th and 20th century history at EUI in Florence. He is an expert on the history of the Habsburg Monarchy and its successor states. He taught for many years at Swarthmore, at the University of Pennsylvania, at New York University, and at Silesian University. He is currently the president of the Central European History Society in North America, which I gather you can do from Florence. Okay. He has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation. He's been a Fulbright, and he's had fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the German Marshall Fund. He was the Nina Marie Gorison Fellow in History in 2011 here at the Academy. And while he was here, he worked on a related project to the one we'll hear about tonight, which was called Everyday Empire, A New History of Habsburg Central Europe, 1780 to 1948. He's written several prize-winning volumes. He received the Karl von Vogelsang State Prize from the Austrian government for his book, Guardians of the Nation, Activists on the Language Frontiers of Imperial Austria, which was published by Harvard. His latest book, The Habsburg Empire, A New History, was also published by Harvard in 2016. So let me just say before I give the floor to Pieter to deliver his lecture, his talk will last about 40 minutes. There will then be a discussion and audience Q&A. If you're with us here, I guess you know how to ask a question. Just raise your hand. If you're joining us on Zoom, don't raise your hand. It won't make any difference. And you'll be home alone raising your hand. Instead, please type a question into the Q&A part of the Zoom platform, and I'll do my very best to get to as many questions as possible. Given the poverty of my knowledge of the Habsburg Empire, we'll probably get a fair number of questions in. So I apologize in advance if I don't get to them all. And with that, Pieter, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Daniel, for the generous introduction. By the way, that project that I never did here was the book that came out in 2016 and has been translated for some reason, and that may come up in the talk, into 12 languages already. I also want to thank you and Barrett especially for offering me the privilege to speak at the Academy in person. My husband, Charles, and I really cherished our time at the Academy. It was a super intense time. It was sometimes a bit wild, and many of the fellows we met then remain our dear friends today. Listening to this year's fellows present their projects last night, I felt envy and wished we could experience what you have all over again. But being here even for 3 days has been amazing, and we want to thank Jessica, Isabel, Mareike, Johanna, Reinhold, and all the staff members who've taken such good care of us. Now, this talk is for the brave historian colleagues who work every day to prevent their societies from sliding further into dictatorship. And I'll mention 2 of them at the end, but there are many others. When 2 years ago, the New York Times published an editorial by 2 friends of mine titled, "What the Habsburg Empire Got Right," and they spelled it wrong, of course, I nearly fell off my chair. The article summarized the revisionist views of Austria-Hungary, for which many of us have argued for the last 20 years. What was shocking was that the Times would even publish an op-ed piece about the Habsburg Monarchy. And it was not alone. From the pages of The Economist, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, the Standard, or the Wall Street Journal, journalists were asking whether multinational Austria-Hungary might have a valuable lesson to teach us about the ongoing popularity crisis of the EU. Could we learn something from an empire that was officially wiped off the map of Europe a century ago? Well, I'm all in favor of more publicity for the multinational Habsburg Empire, partly because, as an historian, I see how the ethnic nation-state model has repeatedly failed societies both in and outside of Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. This is the idea that national groups, usually defined by some combination of language use, religious practice, and racial identity, should have their own states in order to ensure stability and democratic practice. It's an abstract concept at best, because where in Europe, where in the world, could we ever find that kind of cultural homogeneity? And if we found it, would not nationalists simply argue for more exclusive understandings of nationhood, as do some of today's populist nationalist politicians, or as did the Nazis, for example? I mean, you can never be nationalist enough for nationalists. And here I'm promoting a map that I actually disagree with violently. So, this elusive model of the nation-state seems to remain our only viable option, both in political discourse and popular sentiment. On the other hand, the project of European unity was largely born out of a recognition of both the catastrophic political failures and the economic weaknesses of the ethnic nation-state model in Europe. The recent rediscovery of the Habsburg monarchy might be useful for another reason. For too long, propagandists for nation-statehood in Central and Eastern Europe, most of them historians, have shaped how the rest of the world understands that region's history. Those narratives of difference, which I'll explain in a moment, remain highly popular today. They treat an imagined west and east of Europe as fundamentally different, and at times these narratives seem to justify threats to the practice of democracy by making ethnic groups, rather than individual people, into the legitimate actors of history in this region. These narratives assert that ethnic, linguistic, cultural, or racial differences divide people more than other factors in daily life might unify them. Since 1918, Austria-Hungary is usually remembered in one of 2 problematic ways. One of these is the nationalist one. The other is the cosmopolitan or nostalgic one. Now, the nationalist one claims that Austria-Hungary was weak, dysfunctional, and doomed because its people happened to use over 11 different languages and practice at least 8 different religions. This Austria-Hungary was allegedly destroyed by popular nationalist movements, see the picture, that allegedly fought each other and the empire in order to protect what was theirs and ultimately to establish their own nation-states. The second view of the empire often remembers Austria-Hungary in a romantic and nostalgic way, CC. In this version, the Habsburg monarchy ruled over a multicultural society that produced a kind of golden age of cultural, artistic, and scientific flowering and a lot of cafes that was destroyed by radical nationalists, prefiguring Nazism, and by a world war it was fated to lose. Now, this version of the empire, too, was a doomed one. But many people, especially Central European Jews looking back from the vantage point of the 1930s, remembered it with considerable fondness. This nostalgic view, too, expresses ambivalence about the possibility that different cultures can successfully coexist because of the political anti-Semitism and nationalism that flourished in the empire and because it ultimately fell. Now, my view differs from both of these. But above all, I believe we need to interrogate the first of these two views most vigorously, the nationalist one. I am concerned about how easily we normalize the idea of the ethnic group or nation as the only realistic state form, and the degree to which we then discount the other forms, ranging from multinational empires to the European Union. And actually, in my view, all the nation states in the 20th century are multinational anyway, but they just don't talk about it. The citizens of Austria-Hungary often had a lot in common with each other, socially and culturally. Economically, Austria-Hungary was Europe's biggest free trade region before 1914. But these commonalities, which remain visible in the built landscape or on cafe menus or in family histories throughout the world today, these commonalities have been systematically rendered invisible by nationalist mythologies that assert the opposite. And today, once again, they are vigorously promoted by nationalist politicians. The idea that Austria-Hungary was dysfunctional and doomed was easily adopted into the popular imagination. The same view influences today's understandings of the alleged drawbacks, weaknesses, and threats posed to Europeans by the European Union. It's a view that enabled one snide British Brexiteer to write smugly in 2011, quote, "Who would have thought that Imperial Vienna's prison of nations that was smashed open in 1918 would be rebuilt by Brussels," end quote. Well, in the rest of the talk, I'll lay out some of these views. Then I'll invite you to take a second look at the Habsburg Monarchy and its institutions to see what elements did make it distinctive by European standards. I'll explain why I think it was not necessarily doomed to fail, focusing specifically on the monarchy's distinctive language policies and how they became codified in its forms of citizenship. I will also discuss the ambivalent significance of nationalism in this multilingual society and how nationalism related to ideas of empire. I will briefly offer you an alternative to the generally accepted explanation of why the empire collapsed, and if that isn't enough, I will conclude with a few thoughts related to the EU and the corrosive influence of populist nationalism on my profession, and I promise to do it all really fast. In writing about the Habsburg Empire, I tried to look beyond the traditional stereotypes to two other elements. First, how different social groups engaged with the life opportunities that imperial institutions offered them. This is what I call state building from below, people engaging with imperial institutions in their daily lives in terms of things that matter to them. Secondly, a question. Did nationalist conflict relate much to people's everyday life? In what ways was it present? But in what ways was it often absent? In the very image I chose for the cover of the English edition of my History of the Empire, I also sought to counter the stereotypes by evoking the dynamic qualities, the youth, the vigor, the movement, and the modernity of empire, rather than the usual picture of an old emperor that evoked anachronism and feudalism. I had no control over the other covers. In 1914, Austria-Hungary was Europe's second largest state after Russia. In terms of population, it was the third largest state. It covered territory that today is occupied by 12 different states. After the settlement of 1867, the monarchy consisted of two different states with two different constitutions, and later Bosnia-Herzegovina. Austria and Hungary, Hungary here is the sort of bright green plus the darker green of Croatia, Austria-Hungary shared a joint military, a common foreign policy, and common economic arrangements. But in almost every other way, the two states differed radically. In political terms, they were moving in opposite directions. Royal Hungary's leaders treated it as a modern, centralized nation-state, like France, or like Italy aspired to be. Imperial Austria, on the other hand, was becoming more of a federation of regions with no official nationality. Both states guaranteed their citizens a typical range of civil rights for Europe at the time. But Austrians gained universal manhood suffrage for parliament in 1897, for example, well before Britain or Italy. Hungary, on the other hand, maintained a restrictive suffrage. Its leaders feared that enfranchising the lower classes, to which many of its linguistic minorities belonged, might threaten the integrity of the Hungarian state. And because it defined itself as a nation-state, Hungary actually had what we would call national minorities. In 1867, fewer than 50% of Hungarians spoke Hungary, so all of the rest of the people who didn't speak Hungarian were minorities. As in 19th century France, Hungary's leaders insisted on the use of the national language, Hungarian, for most administrative and school purposes. Although back then, Hungary did not define Hungarianness in terms of your ethnic background. After 1867, many Jews in Hungary, for example, abandoned German or Yiddish for Hungarian. And unlike today, they were welcomed as part of the nation. Austria, meanwhile, recognized 11 different language groups or nations, but as a state, Austria had no majority and no minority nation. Primary schooling had to be offered in all major languages in use in a given region or locality. Local administration and courts had to accept documents and testimony in regionally recognized languages. Austria-Hungary's joint military did use the German language of command, and every recruit had to learn a vocabulary of about 80 German phrases. By the way, German-speaking recruits had to learn those 80 phrases too. They were not necessarily known. But if a regiment, I'm sure you're all writing this down, if a regiment had 20% speakers of another language, they had the right to use that language in daily communication with their officers, and the officers had to learn that language. So you must be wondering now whether this rule impeded the efficiency of the military in wartime. Recent studies have actually, and there was a big belief that it had ruined the military, but recent studies, Tamara Shares, for example, have shown the answer is no. What ruined or impeded the Habsburg military during the First World War was the brilliance of its strategists and its high command. German was also the language of the civil servants used to communicate between Vienna and the provinces, although within the individual provinces, communication also took place in local languages in the bureaucracy. In general, as you can imagine, the Austrian half of the monarchy required the services of a lot of professional translators, and it was very expensive. The enormous deficits run up by the individual provinces by 1914 mostly have to do with the cost of all this translation. During the First World War, when Allied propaganda mentioned Austria-Hungary rather than Germany, and the Allies almost never mentioned Austria-Hungary, it was in terms of the way that its rulers, called German and Hungarian fanatics, oppressed the small nations. Writing in 1915, for example, the liberal British historian George Macaulay Trevelyan asserted that Austria-Hungary had long been a hotbed of nationalist discontent thanks to the arrogant treatment of, quote, Slavic subject races, end quote, by their German and Hungarian, quote, masters, end quote. Quote, some people ask why the subject races of Austria-Hungary did not rise in insurrection. And the answer is because all the young men were taken into the military by the modern system of military slavery, and all the leaders were in prison or in exile. End quote. So I think by this, Trevelyan apparently meant the system of universal male military conscription. And by the way, most of these nationalist leaders in Austria, but not Hungary, sat in the parliament. Now I'll say a few words about the collapse of the empire and how it was remembered. In 1918, after 4 years of brutal warfare and miserable home front conditions that included starvation and disease, brought on partially by a British blockade and partially by Russia's occupation of Austria's main food-producing region, and partially by a lot of very poor planning, the empire simply collapsed. Communications and supply systems from the center broke down. Local regions had to fend for themselves. There was no single day on which the empire fell. It happened over a period of a few weeks, starting in October 1918. The empire did not exactly fall to nationalist rebellions either, although many local politicians depicted the fall as the product of national desires. Certainly when the successor states a few years ago celebrated the 100th anniversary of their founding or enlargement in 2018, they told the story of their birth in terms of popular nationalist revolutions. In fact, this is my favorite part, only one of Europe's empires actually experienced a major nationalist insurrection during the First World War, and that, of course, was Great Britain in April of 1916 with the Easter Rising in Ireland. But how was the Austro-Hungarian collapse explained later on? How was empire remembered? And how did the states that replace it legitimize their new existence? Both the Allied propaganda and nationalist politicians in exile presented the collapse as the triumph of popular sovereignty against a cruelly oppressive regime. The nationalist politicians presented themselves as standing on the side of a future that would be democratic and progressive, not authoritarian and old-fashioned. Democracy, they argued, demanded the creation of nation-states because the specific character of Habsburg oppression had been its subjugation of small nations. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Allies, too, sought to portray the war as fought for the sake of emancipating peoples and bringing democracy. Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, Czechoslovakia's great first president, wrote that, quote, "On the whole, great multinational empires are an institution of the past, of a time when material force was held high and the principle of nationality had not been recognized because democracy had not been recognized." Quote. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson made the connection between nation statehood and democracy explicit in that famous term, national self-determination. Never mind that Wilson was an enthusiast of harsh racial segregation back home and an American colonial regime in the Philippines, and that the liberated peoples of the Middle East were put under Allied imperial control in so-called mandates. Of course, in hindsight, it's easy to see how claims about the democratic potential of nation-states were propagandistic in character. In particular, I want to point out the glaring question here when people talk about national self-determination. Who actually got to experience popular sovereignty and national self-determination? Was it the individual, or was it instead the national community? Did the individual exercise any decision-making power over her fate, or did the national community make decisions for her? Well, you can see from the way I phrased it what I think the answer is. In 1918, it was clearly the latter. The Habsburg Empire, caricatured as the prison of the peoples, became a useful foil against which the new nation-states could define themselves as dynamic, forward-looking, democratic, and self-consciously modern. And of course, all of them harbored imperial ambitions. The idea of the empire as a prison of the peoples remained useful for decades. It became part of an enduring explanation for such apparent phenomena as the ongoing economic backwardness, a word we used to use in the 1970s, of Eastern Europe, or the alleged inability of states in Eastern Europe to develop durable political democratic systems. During the Cold War, social scientists often treated Europe's East as a region made up of ethnic mosaics that were so complex it was impossible for normal democratic states to emerge there. The region had been ripe for domination by large multinational empires, including the Soviet Union. But if Austria-Hungary had sat poised on the brink of extinction, thanks to nationalist revolt, why did the major national rebellion of World War I happen in Dublin and not Prague, Ljubljana, or Zagreb? Why don't we speak more about the British state as an anachronism in the 20th century? Despite the crises precipitated there by the Irish question or labor unrest. And why shouldn't we see in the British Empire the most corrosive example of nationalist conflict or nationalist oppression within Europe? And why do we continue to see ethnicity, multilingualism, and the ethnic mosaic as a problem particular to Europe's east and south, and not of its north and west? Why also do we see the Habsburg or Ottoman empires continuously described as alien impositions, as if local people played no role at all in the daily life of empire? Well, the answer to these questions returns us to how Europe's new states legitimated themselves in 1918. And it also has to do with the way the historical profession is organized largely by national schools, how historians have treated nations rather than people as the subjects of their histories, and with the question of who pays for history writing in these states since 1918 or since 1989. I'll have a bit more to say about that at the end. Let's take a look at the Habsburg Monarchy now in order to understand in what ways it was similar to other European states and what made it distinctive and why it might not have been doomed to failure. So the Habsburg state, and here it is in 1815, was still in the making when many other European states had already established themselves. There was really no Habsburg state until the 1700s, when the dynasty began seriously to integrate and centralize its various holdings that it had previously ruled according to different systems and laws. Officially, there was no Austrian Empire until 1804. In this sense, Austria was actually one of Europe's newest states. This period was one of intense state building, as the dynasty worked to take privilege away from the regional nobilities, to emancipate the peasants from serfdom so they could be more economically productive, and to offer social mobility to the educated and financial middle classes in the new bureaucracies that were supposed to carry out these reforms. In many ways, social, economic, and cultural, the Habsburg monarchy resembled other European states. Here's the Civil Code of 1811, for example, that confirmed that Austrians were not simply subjects, but rather citizens with equal legal rights. Women, too, were technically granted full rights of citizenship and could run a business, although if married, of course, their husbands exercised many rights over them. In terms of public education, Austria was a leader in Europe. In 1774, Empress Maria Theresa had established an education requirement for children of both sexes, which, of course, she hadn't funded. In 1869, Imperial Austria imposed and funded 8 years of primary education for both boys and girls, as well as teacher training institutes for both men and women. Literacy rates in Imperial Austria around 1910 were comparable to those of France, about 85%, although they varied by region. Austria and Hungary experienced booms, economic busts, industrial growth spurts during the 19th century that produced islands of industry and urban societies just as in the rest of Europe. In 1848, revolutions produced elected institutions in both Austria and Hungary, institutions that were later revived and elaborated in constitutions in the 1860s. Austria also granted self-government to local towns and villages, allowing them to create their own economic development plans and infrastructures, and to pay for them. One element that made the state distinctive, though, had to do with language law and practice. And this is where the myths around nationalities and conflict come from. Traditional Habsburg language policy was pragmatic. The state relied on local languages to publicize laws and for elementary schooling. In Hungary, for example, Latin had been the language of the Diet, precisely because Latin was a universal language that nobody knew. It was no one's national language. At the end of the 18th century, the Habsburgs tried to replace Latin in Hungary with German because they argued that Latin could no longer accommodate modern technological developments. But, and they failed miserably in this regard, they never imposed a single language on their subjects the way, for example, the French did. Recall that as late as 1863, over a quarter of the French population spoke no French. So during the 19th century, this pragmatism became increasingly asserted by citizens as a question of civil rights to be enshrined in a constitution, and here is the text from the Austrian constitution. The social scientists among you will not be surprised by the unpredictable dynamics that all of this produced. If you have a constitution that promises some equality in language use, but real practice does not systematically conform to this promise, well then language use in public becomes a fruitful area or arena where politicians will develop agendas and demands. When demands are met, they produce more demands. The framers of the Austrian constitution guaranteed primary schooling in local languages. But should this principle apply to secondary schools? How about universities? In what cases should a locality have to offer schooling in a minority language? All of these questions were subjects of vigorous political debate and interesting Supreme Court decisions, and the courts usually upheld the expanding claims of the nationalists. So within the context of imperial law and practice, nationhood became a more elaborated concept, very much pushed from below by activists and politicians. As more and more men got the vote, political leaders adopted more radical nationalist demands to mobilize more voters. They demonstrated their commitment to the nation by insisting on ideological or national purity. This must sound so familiar. Like many parliamentarians today, they performed this commitment in increasingly radical ways, using every means at their disposal to obstruct their opponents. During a particularly vivid crisis in the Austrian parliament, one radical German nationalist deputy even challenged the prime minister, a Polish aristocrat, to a duel, which they actually fought, although they had to get the emperor's permission first. Historians saw this level of conflict as a sign of fundamental social tension, as if these nationalist performances in parliament reflected a real level of conflict in Austro-Hungarian society. But did it? Nationalists were not the product of warring nations, so much as they were desperately trying to create warring nations. Nationalists worked hard to convince local people that nationhood mattered to them or should matter to them, that they should belong to a national community. But even if the antics of these politicians were popular, they often failed in the larger effort to nationalize people decisively. The population may have voted for nationalist parties, or when the national community appeared to be threatened by an unfavorable law imposing new street signs in an unfamiliar language. But there's surprisingly little evidence that nationhood dominated people's everyday lives the way nationalists wanted it to. My own research from the multi-ethnic borderlands revealed that a lot of people were what I would call situationally indifferent to nationalist conflict. This perceived indifference only made the nationalists more radical in their behavior. More importantly, and this might surprise you, most nationalists were also good imperial patriots. What they wanted for their community was a better position within the empire. They were not straining to escape from a prison of peoples. Except for the most radical among them, nationalists often defined their national pride in terms of their imperial patriotism. Their politicians may have been very loud, but most of the time they were also busy trying to influence government appointments, to build up their own influence, especially in the regional civil services. At the same time, the Habsburg regime, despite its profound lack of imagination, was rethinking traditional justifications for empire, like what's the point of this empire? In the earlier centuries, they had always been the defenders of the Catholic Church against Islam, or Protestantism, which was even worse. Or they associated their empire with the Universal Roman Empire in Germany and Italy. But in the 19th century, they were ejected from the new Italian and German nation states. And they adopted policies of religious toleration. And ironically, the Emperor of Austria even became the protector of Muslims in Bosnia. So they had to develop new justifications. And now their empire existed to protect and encourage the cultural, economic, and social advancements of the small nations over which it ruled. One of the dynasty's most ambitious works, begun in the 1880s, was a series of 24 volumes called The Austro-Hungarian Monarchy in Word and Picture. Under the patronage, there was an Austrian version and a Hungarian version, of course, under the patronage of the ill-fated Crown Prince Rudolf, and with the participation of scholars, artists, and scientists from every region of the monarchy, many of them hardcore nationalists, the series conveyed a picture of both the cultural diversity and the unity of the empire. Empire was defined by the diverse nations over which it ruled, and those nations were given a political space to act as such by the empire. But if you thought you were a nation, or you wanted to have a nation, and this actually gets to Yanni Kotsonis' project a little bit, only he deals with an earlier period. If you wanted to be a nation, you wanted the rights that empire bestowed on nation, well, you had to insist that your nation was different enough from the nation next door in order to constitute something different, right? You had to constantly insist on difference. It didn't matter that people who spoke different languages often shared the same social backgrounds or the same material cultures or practiced the same religions. Nationalists insisted that radical differences separated cultures to justify demanding autonomy. By 1900, Austria's nationalist groups in Austria gained quite a few legal rights based on their claims of group belonging. In Hungary, the state clamped down forcefully, even on modest nationalist demands. But in Austria, the state acted also as a kind of arbiter or umpire to guarantee civic and constitutional order among individuals and national groups. And in Austria, and this is kind of important because it's changed dreadfully after 1918, national belonging was up to the individual. It was not ascribed or objectively defined by the state as it would be after 1918. The institutions that regulated these incredibly complex laws were extraordinary by European standards. But I want to say, on the one hand, that these institutions are really interesting and they try to make room for all kinds of difference in public life, they also tended to work towards exaggerating forms of difference and to creating nations that saw themselves or asserted themselves as being radically different from each other, to the point, I would argue, of what we would today call racial differences. Okay, but why did the state collapse? I argue that it collapsed because of the strains of war and because it lost its legitimacy as the arbiter or umpire. Every combatant state lost legitimacy during the war. France, for example, almost collapsed in 1917 with mutinies at the front and strikes at home. But the dynamics of the Austro-Hungarian situation made things worse. The military elite of Austria-Hungary had for decades disapproved of the political direction taken by both halves of the empire. They especially thought that increased democratization created dangerous political conflict, that the civil administration was simply too politicized. War became an opportunity for them to turn the monarchy back to an imagined pre-political time when there had been no conflict at all. After the Austro-Hungarian annexation of Bosnia, it looked like war would come to the Balkans. These men used the fears of the coming war to develop secret legislation to give themselves enormous wartime powers. When Austria-Hungary declared war in 1914, the High Command took over the civilian administration, abrogated most civil rights, and replaced civil justice with a harsh military justice, and worse, gave rein to their own deeply held prejudices against some of the monarchy's language groups and persecuted them mercilessly. The Habsburg state had functioned because enough people thought that their interests were engaged by the state. Peasants saw in it the possibility of emancipation. Sons and daughters of the middle class gained employment and social mobility in an expanding civil service. Entrepreneurs in ports like Trieste and Fiume had enjoyed tax breaks that supported global trade, and all of this without reference to your linguistic or religious background. But for 2.5 years, a military dictatorship contradicted every single one of the popular expectations that fostered people's loyalty. Although society responded to the war declaration with patriotism, the military dictatorship ruthlessly pursued innocent people, especially those of Serb or Ukrainian and later Italian linguistic or religious background. It executed thousands of alleged traitors without any proof. It jailed thousands more. It interned whole populations in camps. And also refugee camps were invented in Austria-Hungary. And all of this happened during a period of intense deprivation. Failed food rationing, rampant rumors that replaced the censored news. It wasn't just intolerable suffering that produced the end of this empire, it was a clear sense of profound betrayal. When the last emperor, King Charles, came to the throne in November of 1916, he tried to reverse the situation. He reopened the parliament, he amnestied the political prisoners, he funded new welfare programs, but it was far too late. There was simply no one willing to defend the empire. To conclude, and sorry I've gone on so long, in the official narratives, national museums, commemorations, and monuments produced by the states that replaced Austria-Hungary, the empire remains to this day a prison of the peoples. In the 20th century, these narratives allowed nationalists to keep arguing, despite all the evidence to the contrary, that the only legitimate and viable kind of state organization in the region is the nation-state. This fact presents historians with several dilemmas. In the last decades, we historians have actually been more interested in trying to think and write outside the constraints of individual national histories. We've pursued histories organized in transnational ways, global, regional, or local ways, rather than histories based on nation states. But especially in the last decades, publics and governments have moved in the other direction. Writing this talk, I was keenly aware of the renewed role that political nationalism plays in government-supported histories and public projects in Central and Eastern Europe today. Most of you know all about the politics in Hungary that produced the expulsion of the Central European University from Budapest, but you may not be as aware of the parallel efforts of the Orbán regime to control professional writing of history. The government uses fiscal policy to starve Hungary's most respected institutions of historical research, such as the Institute for Political History, headed by Gábor Egri, pictured here, while it lavishes funds on new institutions staffed with cronies who, along with well-paid visiting fellows, can be counted on to produce narratives about Hungary and Europe that the regime demands. Last year in Slovenia, the coalition government of right-wing populist Janez Janša announced plans to build a nationalist museum of independence that will offer an unapologetically nationalist picture of the region's history. At the same time, Janša fired professional women and men with major international reputations from museum directorships. Here you see Kaja Širok, former director of the Museum of Contemporary History in Ljubljana, and then he installed men with almost no qualifications. In Poland, the current government promotes its vision of history by attempting to outlaw alternative narratives, both in museums and publications. So the story I've tried to tell you here cannot easily be told today in those countries. The brave women and men who try to tell those stories today are under siege. There are, of course, other issues. How should historians in these successor states treat their own imperial pasts? Should they render invisible the ways that their ancestors participated in empire? Should they render invisible the ways separate groups apparently mixed socially, culturally, and sexually? And does it really make sense to view the Habsburg Empire or the Ottoman Empire as alien presences in Europe? And to think more positively, what useful lessons might the history of Austria-Hungary reveal to us at this moment? How about the idea that it was possible for a modern and dynamic state to function with 11 official languages? Or we could explore what I called state building from below. When people engage with state structures because they see promise for pursuing their own interests effectively, they will engage with the state more actively. But it must be clear to people how and in what ways the state's interests align with individual and community interests. We could recognize that after World War I, or in Yugoslavia in the 1980s, we saw what happens when there is no legitimate supranational institution to enforce fairness. Radical nationalists became unmoored from their previous limits under empire, and only then did radical policies of ethnic homogenization and ethnic cleansing become imaginable and also probable. Thank you very much.
So much information on the table. I should begin, though, by noting that this is, in essence, a continuation of a discussion that's been going on at the Academy, probably long before my time, but just in the last year, we've had two fascinating installments in the discussion of empire and diversity, one of which was presented last spring, by our fellow Nandini Pandey, a classical scholar who talked about how the Roman Empire used diversity to its advantage. And then we also had a discussion with your colleague, John Connolly of Berkeley, who took a very different perspective in his book, Peoples into Nations. But I think that this question of the ability of large multilingual, multi-ethnic entities, their ability to live together, and also the resurrection of the true past will be with us for quite some time. One question that I wanted to start off with was you noted the difference between Austria and Hungary in that period. And one of the things that comes out in Connolly's book in particular is also this difference. And as you mentioned, Hungarian was spoken by less than 50% of the inhabitants of Hungary after the establishment of the dual monarchy. And I wonder if there wasn't kind of a dynamo effect created by the efforts of Hungarian elites to force ever greater parts of the population to speak Hungarian, and if that didn't actually help create the understanding that we have in hindsight of this multi-ethnic empire.
That's a really good question. And by the way, thank you for being so patient with my rather long talk. I wanted to point out that Hungary behaved like France, because I don't want to make Hungary into the villain here. I want to normalize it a bit. But on the other hand, the problem, I would say, Hungary was actually able to raise the percentage of people who spoke Hungarian. By 1910, it was closer to 55%. But we finally now have some local studies of how this Hungarianization effort worked at the local level. And what we've learned is that they just didn't have the money to impose it in a way that really made much of a difference very often. So it's hard to say what the effect was. At the political level, it was enormous. And also remember that all the nationalist leaders in Hungary knew exactly what was happening in Austria. So they were using a lot of the tactics that they saw in Austria in a very different context. But yes, I'm quite sure that the Hungarian policy contributed to that way of looking at the oppressive empire.
And, where was the monarchy in this picture? As I recall, the Habsburgs had a lot of uneasiness and sensitivity about dealing with Hungary, which was feeling itself ever more potent and sort of more challenged to take its place on the international stage. And so there was, to some extent, a hands-off kind of policy towards what was going on internally in Hungary at the time. Yeah,
there was absolutely, well, it's tricky. When there were crises in Hungary, and there were around these issues of the relationship to Austria, the sort of ultimate trick that the emperor had in his black box was the threat of universal manhood suffrage. So that when the Hungarians pushed things to the limit, this was always the response from the emperor, and then the Hungarians would back down because the last thing they wanted was that. But on the other hand, you could also argue that the the king of Hungary was very hands-off, that he wanted the constitution and the system to work. He expected politicians to be in power who would make it work. He expected they would keep the radicals out. And as long as all that happened, he wasn't going to interfere. But the last king, Charles, at the end of the war, when it was insane that they wouldn't increase the suffrage even to the men who were the veterans, finally tried to push it through. But of course, it was way too late.
Right. One of the notable things about the 19th century and the Habsburg Empire was the effort to essentially sort of increase at least the illusion of democratic participation, if not so much the reality. And to what extent did that also create group consciousness that wasn't there before?
You couldn't have had these movements without the development of politics,
right,
obviously. And actually, when you say the illusion of, I wouldn't call it democratic, I might call it liberal, but I would also say...
Participatory.
Yeah. Folks, this is the 19th century. Like, what do you think is happening in England? Do you think they're any more democratic? I don't think so. So what I want to say is that in the Austrian half, this actually did make a huge difference. And one of the reasons that the courts kept pushing further, kept giving more and more rights to people on the basis of nationhood was because people kept bringing cases. And they brought cases because they knew what the Constitution said. There were a lot of lawyers, and they used the system. So I would say definitely liberalization, greater participation. And when I say national indifference, I don't mean that people were never nationalists. I simply mean that they were only nationalists in some situations, like elections.
Right.
Then everybody goes crazy and riots and,
So, among the other things that the Habsburg Empire created, I guess some of your colleagues would argue, is the rise of political anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
So situate that for us in this in this tableau, and in particular, the sort of roiled feeling of German consciousness, the desire of Austrian Germans to unite with the new Reich. It's a big question, but I think you're up to it.
Okay, first I'm going to say, you heard it here, but many historians have said it. The German speakers in the Habsburg monarchy on the whole didn't want to be part of the new German Reich, right, because being part of the new German Reich would mean being part of a Protestant empire. And there are a few politicians like Georg von Schirner, whom Hitler loved, who didn't get many votes but made a lot of noise, who promoted this idea of German speakers being part of Germany, but honestly, that was not an issue. However, anti-Semitism, okay. Anti-Semitism is a European phenomenon. The depression that's often blamed on rising anti-Semitism in Austria happens first in Vienna in 1873. Vienna is the site of the first really massively successful anti-Semitic political party that elects the mayor Karl Lueger, to whom there is still a statue standing on the Ringstrasse today. No comment. Although it has been defaced many times. And the emperor 3 times refused to allow Lueger to become mayor, but he finally had to give in. At the same time, what this suggested to a lot of Jews, especially in Galicia, was that Jews were a nation. And and a lot of Jewish activists in the 1880s especially began to organize themselves and to try to get recognition for Jews as a nation, like German speakers, Czech speakers. And there was, of course, anti-Semitism among all the groups, right? There's a lot of Czech anti-Semitism, German anti-Semitism, whatever. Polish, of course. In Galicia, often the Jewish Nationalist Party often Zionists were not exactly clear about their ultimate goal, because their mid-range goal was to create a sense of Jewish nationhood, have Jews vote at election time for Jewish parties, and they succeeded in several parts of Galicia and Bukovina. And I think this is really crucial for later understandings of Zionism, that the understanding of what it means to be a nation is sort of Jewish activists doing the same things that all the other activists are doing as well, and we should see it in that political context. Sorry to go on, but quickly, twice Jewish parliamentarians brought lawsuits to the Supreme Court, asking that Jews be considered one of the nations of Austria, and the question was rejected because in Austria nationhood was defined by language use, and Jews spoke many different languages. This was the text of the... but on the other hand, in the... Oh, God, I'm so sorry. There are too many wonderful details, and they're wonderful to me. Within the intimate discussions of the Supreme Court, we also know that some of the justices really were thinking that one perhaps ought to allow this idea of Jewish nationhood. But of course, it didn't happen, and there was no legal argument for it, but in any case.
Fascinating. Well, I have to come back and do a whole talk on that one for us. So I'm going to hand it over to the audience here, and someone's going to help me get to the audience here because I can't seem to find them. But how much should we blame Woodrow Wilson for this mess?
If any of you have seen Larry Wolf's new book on Woodrow Wilson's sort of how he came to learn about Eastern Europe, it's really insightful. And Wilson personalized everything. By the end, he sort of was being promoted by Paderewski and Masaryk as the sort of emancipator, and he liked that. I mean, Wilson liked being the center of attention.
Well, he was profoundly vain.
Yeah. But interestingly enough, the ways in which he didn't and did see comparisons to the United States, or the way people tried to say, oh, look, this situation is like this situation in the United States, sometimes worked, sometimes didn't. And of course, you all know about Wilson's racial policy.
Right.
So
actually, I'm going to just ask one more question, which was, you distinguish at the beginning between two different kinds of views of the Habsburg Empire, and the nostalgic one, as I recall, everyone had a picture of the emperor hanging in their house. That was kind of a cliche.
Yeah.
How true was that of non-German speakers or not native right?
I understand. So actually, the place where we have most of these stories about the portraits is Galicia, which is, of course, Polish-speaking and Ukrainian in terms of religion. But I want to quickly say, peasants who had a portrait of the emperor didn't... it wasn't because they were stupid. It wasn't because they loved authority. There's very much a tradition that it was the Austrian emperors who had freed Polish peasants and Ukrainian peasants from the depredations of the evil Polish nobility. And this is a long tradition. So I would say that stereotype is true. But what it meant is a lot of different things.
Right. Okay, so I want to invite anyone who is watching to send those questions in. And I want to ask our audience to just raise their hands if they have any questions that they would like to put to Peter. No one can pick questions to me. Yes, Mitch.
Right.
Just wait for the mic. Great.
Thank you very much. Peter knows that I am a historian of science, and so I'm going to ask about the science. But before I do that, I'm going to make a remark about the Jews, because there are many, many memories, Jewish memories, of the Kaiser's picture on the wall in Jewish homes in Bohemia and other places, for the simple reason that they received full citizenship at the Kaiser's hand in 1867. Of course, the Constitution was not invented by the Kaiser, but that's the way it was portrayed. And this kind of legitimism is very important because in the 1850s, there had already been an attempt to make a nation of the empire centered around the emperor himself and the court, which didn't work out so well. But that's a whole other story. I just wanted to have added this point about the Jews because I think it's relevant. Their loyalty to the empire was quite sincere because they had been given this great gift of citizenship. To go back to the sciences, the standard argument has always been that natural science is either international or it's not science. That's a cliche. It's constantly repeated. It's simply not true, but never mind. The Habsburg Empire is a wonderful place to show how wrong this view is. What I think is going on here instead is what it could be actually generalized more broadly is a nationalization process. And it may be extending to the culture as a whole, not only to the sciences, but you can see it in the sciences quite clearly. The idea being, of course, which language do you publish your results in? Yeah. If you're Czech or if you're Polish. Are you going to be a patriot and publish in your Polish language and Czech language journal of chemistry that has just been invented? Or are you going to publish in German, which was at that time the predominant international language of science? Yeah. And the ways they dealt with that are really quite fascinating. I won't go into detail, but in many cases they had both Czech and German language publications in the same discipline. So you publish the same paper in both languages. Wouldn't it be interesting if we tried that today, but never mind. The point being that nationalization doesn't necessarily have to be monolinguistic. And countries like Sweden and Holland showed that you can have a nation without insisting on monolinguistic nationalism. And in the case of the sciences, that didn't work out in the end. After 1918, you have these nation states, and they all insist that the scientists publish in the local language if they want to be able to teach at these universities. Masaryk was famously liberal on this issue, but he wasn't president for very long. Yeah. And that became the predominant view. And so one could argue, in an almost ironic sense, that the success of nationalization in this context was a disaster for the sciences in these countries.
Yep. Mitchell Ash, whose works you can also read on this subject. And also, I just want to mention Jan Sorman and Debbie Cohen, who've written, I think, also really interestingly on this question. And the division after the war is really important as a disaster. And we should also remember that it was a disaster economically as well. That the destruction of Europe's largest free trade zone and division into all these different places was also a disaster. I mean, there are many disasters.
You had a question. Just wait for the mic, please.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that wonderful talk. I mean, we all knew that nations are an invention, but now I at least learned that nationalism is also an invention and didn't actually exist in the 19th century, or at least not nearly as much as we commonly imagine, and that, in fact, it was nationalism that brought down the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire brought forth a false memory of nationalism. At least that's one of the things I learned from your talk. I'm an early modernist, and you to some extent you said it. I mean, all these later so-called nations, like France, most of all, were puzzles of different languages, or what would later be called ethnic groups. You could call them all, on the face of it, they're all similar to Austria-Hungary in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. You could call them empires or whatever you want. They consisted of different groups of people speaking different languages. So why did they not fail, whereas the Austro-Hungarian Empire ultimately failed? That's a question you kind of implicitly asked, and which is much stimulated by your talk. So there are different possibilities to answer this. One is that, as you said, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was late. So the reconquest of Hungary, as it were, from the Ottomans, and even Italy, the northern parts of Italy came to Austria late, and they left again. and the Polish partitions, end of the 18th century. So in that sense, it was late. But again, if nationalism wasn't really that important in the 19th century, still, what did it matter that it was later than others?
You're an early modernist, so I think you know the answer, that the regional power is what's so important. Right, not so much nationhood, but the fact that there's a Polish nobility, or with their own rules and laws.
Yeah.
So
that I had two other potential explanations in mind. So if you look at Spain, was an artificial nation that grew together, and it still hasn't grown completely together, as we know. The same with France, the same with the British Isles, etc. But if we look at the languages, I mean, what did play a big role is that the fact that these were all continuous linguistic spaces. So much as Catalonian might differ from Spanish, or the southern French from the northern French, there were continuities. I mean, you might argue Irish Gaelic was a totally different language family, and Finnish was different from Swedish or Russian. But otherwise, all these large state or empires were comprised linguistic continuities, whereas Austria-Hungary happened to be on a fault line, on various fault lines at the same time. You have Germanic, Italian, so Romanic, you have Hungarian, and you have Slavic languages. 4 language families that are essentially mutually incomprehensible, as opposed to all the different languages spoken in all the other countries, empires, even Russia to some extent. So did that play a major role? Or another explanation, as you just maybe also hinted at, Austria-Hungary comprised regions that had been parts or had been kingdoms with their own dynasties for many centuries. That wasn't the case on the Iberian Peninsula, in France and elsewhere. So they had a very strong identity. They had high nobilities that could reach back to previous centuries. So did that kind of historical memory and this kind of, not national because that's anachronistic, but dynastic past have played a role? And how does this dynastic past and the very different linguistic pasts correlate to each other?
Well, first I'll say that I think everyone who studies the 19th century should also study the early modern, because the way we tend to formulate questions is from the point of view of the 20th century, reading back what we know now. I think that you're absolutely correct about all of those factors. I don't particularly think that the radical differences in language, in the various languages that make up this empire, necessarily have to result in any particular outcome. I could imagine many different outcomes. And I would not want us to think that because these language groups are so different, that's why the state couldn't work. But it's certainly a possibility. And for me, the idea of the late statehood is terribly important. That what Marie Theresa and Joseph II are trying to do comes at a point that's long after other states have been doing it and building these institutions for some time.
Yanni, just wait for the mic.
Oh, sorry. So thank you very much for your talk. I saw it equally as trying to salvage something from the empires that might be useful about how we think about things today. Also an indictment of nationalism. What they got wrong, in other words, particularly in that immediate post-1918 period. I'm wondering if we could also, agree maybe that they're nations in their nations, which is to say that, nationalism is very often ridiculous, right? Ranging from that to the dangerous. But there's nations and there's nations, right? So, I know you had a lot to say in a very short period of time, and you gave us the most telling examples at the end, which was 2 clowns, one from Slovenia and the other one from Hungary, right? You'll admit that they're probably not typical of the European spectrum, right? All right, but we can. I think. I mean, there are people who try to deal with nation states in different ways, right? Yeah. So that's my one query, and I know that you know, and so anyway, I thought we may be able to talk about it a little bit. But the other one was, so by a certain metric, you're arguing, and I think compellingly, that Austria-Hungary, even the Hungarian part to some extent, got diversity right. And we're talking about ethnic, linguistic, and confessional diversity. I think there's a compelling argument to be made for that. Others had tried and failed, like the Ottoman Empire. And, by that metric, Austria looks better than many of the other examples, like French intolerance, for example, when it came to language, secretly about religion, not to mention Germany, not to mention Britain itself. And so there is a case to be made, I think. By a different metric, I think the empires failed all across the board, and this is one of the reasons why they were in such danger. And what I have in mind is the social question, which is to say questions of sheer poverty. Questions of these regimes were not that well able to handle. What do you do about the slums? What do you do about the boom and bust of employment and unemployment? How do you deal with the new working class? How do you deal with the peasantry? How do you bring them above subsistence? All these kinds of social questions. And I think all the empires did not do very well with this.
I have to disagree with that part of it because...
But I'll finish. And
okay,
then
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So they tried, and it took a long time for other ones to at least try to get that right. And I think here the parallel with the EU today, I think, is very relevant, as you yourself say. So the EU can take lessons about diversity, but could also take lessons about how to deal with inequality and poverty. Yeah. And it's not doing very well.
Yeah.
Right?
No, you're right. Yeah.
Okay.
The only thing I was going to say was that, interestingly, Austria has one of the most developed social democratic movements. It's got one of the earliest welfare programs after Germany. It does pretty well on that count. I think the question of inequality, though, counts for all European states. Think of Italy. But then I think all European states are empires, or want to be, one way or another. And I also think it's useful to think about what you said about there's nations and there's nations. Because in one sense, no people will ever be nationalist enough for nationalists, right? So, on the other hand, and now I'm thinking of Yugoslavia, Dan, when we had the horrendous wars in Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Kosovo, the first explanations we turned to were ones about ethnic difference, as if conflict must... you know this. I mean, we've all read this. I didn't first say this. As if conflict must arise when there are ethnic differences. And I think if we think that, then we're not looking for the real interesting origins of conflict in the situation. And I always think we have to remember the situation is what matters, not sort of the identity of this person or that person, but what the demands of the situation are. So I think in that sense, there are nations and there are nations. It's true. I mean, a lot of the people I think of, they might have thought, yeah, I'm part of some German nation, but, that doesn't mean I'm going to kill my Czech-speaking neighbor, or it also doesn't mean that I might marry her and something else. So, yeah.
Okay, well, we do have one question that has come in. Actually, we have more than one question that's come in. From viewers, and let me start off with this one. Franz Josef was specially admired among Serbs in the Habsburg monarchy, even many years after World War II. Pictures of the old emperor were quite present in everyday life of Serbs in Austria-Hungary, quite opposite of Franz Ferdinand, who was very unpopular. Some similarities among other Slavs in the Habsburg monarchy.
The question being, this is similar to other Slavic groups?
Yes.
Yeah. I can't speak for this Serb issue. And ironically, Franz Ferdinand's the one that was hated by the Hungarians because he was sympathetic to creating a Slav state. But let's forget that for the moment. There's a lot of, I think, it's hard to measure loyalty, but I would say there's certainly a lot of loyalty among Slovenes, Croatians, but it's situational, right? They love Franz Josef, the Croatians especially. They love Franz Josef because he's Emperor of Austria, but not because he's King of Hungary, because they make a lot out of him as the Austrian because they're angry at the Hungarians. So if you see what I'm saying, it's these kinds of loyalties have to be understood in a situational context.
Can you just wait for the microphone?
Dan is the expert about the Serbs.
No, thanks. Not really. But Dejan Jokic. Thanks, Peter, for this wonderful talk. Very quickly about the Serbs. Actually, there was another territory within this empire, the military border, which it lasts until 1881, I think, if I remember correctly. And so many Serbs, or those who were considered as such Orthodox South Slav-speaking population of the military border, were indeed very loyal to the empire, and this again did not necessarily contradict their feeling of Serbdom, as I think you mentioned, many nationalists were also very loyal to the empire.
It's good that you mentioned the military frontier, because yes, these particular populations were settled in a particular region to protect the empire, and many of them were religiously Serb, and
And just very quickly on something you mentioned in the beginning, I quite like that I think you imply that Ireland is also a successor state in the interwar period. And that's not my original. Hubert Butler, a great Anglo-Irish writer who was actually interested in Yugoslavia and spent some time in Yugoslavia in the 1930s, he always considered Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, as one of the successor states, in addition to East Central Europeans. Just a brief comment.
Another question from a viewer, someone who knows you, but under the Datenschutz, we're not allowed to name them.
I want to know who was asking these questions.
I'll tell you afterwards. Okay. Great talk, so informative and rich. This person raises the question about the relatively recent revival of Habsburg symbols in Central and Eastern Europe's public spaces, including the reappearance of statues that were destroyed after 1918 by radical nationalists, and I guess you mentioned that in your paper. I wonder what you think this means and what it says about the region today and where it sits with all the worrying illiberal trends that you also mentioned.
This is a really interesting question. So, I'm thinking of the Empress Elizabeth in Trieste, or actually, I think it's the new crazy Maria Theresa statue in Prague, which looks really bizarre. Just Google it. The way I see this, again, is in a highly situational sense, is that if a region wants to express its independence from the nation state, then it might raise a statue or refurbish a statue that has Habsburg significance. I remember when I traveled to Bukovina maybe 8 years ago, and I was fascinated the way Černivci, the former Černovec, with a population of people who really came there after 1945, nevertheless was presenting itself as a kind of 19th century Bukovina where there are all these people of different languages who live together in harmony, and that is their regional identification. I think that's what this is about, is regional identity. And in that sense, that can be a bit of a blow against the kind of hardcore populist nationalism. I mean, again, Trieste is always the center of this battle.
Interesting and apposite observation. I was in Kaliningrad in the 1990s where they were having a Kant revival. And there was a big new statue of Kant outside the cathedral. And
what did that mean?
I thought it meant they wanted investment from Germany.
I think you're right.
But it was a fascinating development and made for an interesting newspaper article. So
I've always wanted to go to Kaliningrad.
Yeah, well, and 100% population replacement. There are no Germans in Kaliningrad. So an interesting question from Turkey. The Slavs in the monarchy also had a number of political plans. More precisely, they were Austro-Slavists, and they wanted the monarch to transform the monarchy into a confederation. And a trialistic political model. František Palacký, Stepan Radić made some kind of plans which were based on this model. However, Austria preferred political cooperation with Hungarians. My question is, if Austria had taken into consideration such political demands from the Slavs, would the monarchy have had a chance to survive? The Slavs, it's worth recalling, were the majority population in the monarchy.
Yes, if you imagine that all of these Slavic groups actually agreed with each other and could actually speak I shouldn't say speak because they could, but rather form a unified position. And I cannot imagine that happening. The person asking the question is referring in part to 1848 when Franciszek Palecki says, if Austria, I'm paraphrasing, if it didn't exist, we'd have to invent it, proposing that the Slavs, as a majority of the population, if you took them all together, should rule should influence and shape Habsburg policy. But that would imagine that the emperor actually took seriously nationhood and nationalism. And no Habsburg could do that because the monarchy was patrimony. I mean, Franz Joseph was constitutional monarch, and so was Charles. And Franz Joseph obeyed the constitution, sort of, especially in later years. But he viewed this state as his. And to say, let's transform it into a Slavic, why would you do that? Because that would be nationalism. Franz Joseph didn't think of himself as German, for example. Okay, so then Stepan Radic, which I can't really answer about, but I would say that the trialistic idea, which was supported allegedly by Franz Ferdinand, who was ironically murdered by a Bosnian Serb, Franz Ferdinand supported the idea of creating a third part of Austria-Hungary, maybe using Bosnia as the sort of anchor for it, to take power away from the Hungarians. I doubt it could have happened, but these are all ideas people had and there are lots of ideas for reforming the monarchy. But if you want my opinion about this, the way the monarchy survived was not by big reform plans, but always by making small changes here and there and never admitting it. That's how you get by. Incremental changes, recognition. Okay, we've got to deal with this problem. We can't pretend we don't have it anymore. So that's
okay. Well, we have one more question. We're getting to the end of our time. I have one question from another viewer, and then I may put one more to you.
Sure.
So it's a Polish historian is being quoted here in the Polish historiography. Long-ruling Kaiser Franz Joseph and his entourage presented as passive and a no-talent politician. My question is, do you agree with this? Or maybe Franz Joseph represented a more modern and more nuanced way of influencing the affairs of state by the monarchy than through the direct personal decisions of the monarch himself?
That's a really good question. My view is that Franz Joseph started off as a catastrophe politically. He had very bad political instincts. He made all the wrong choices. He took Austria into 2 wars it couldn't win. Well, 3, but the first 2. And he was not a good listener. That's just one way of putting it. And everybody hated him, by the way. I mean, popular Franz Joseph was hated the first decade of his rule. And I think after the 1870s, he had to follow the Constitution. He realized he had to be quiet about his own opinions. That's why he never said anything more than, it's very nice, and that's that. He was more careful, and he became more beloved for various reasons. And in a way, he was a constitutional monarch. And in that sense, you could say modern, although it's hard to attach the adjective modern to Franz Joseph in any way. But he certainly was not the person he was in 1848, 1850s, who really thought he could come in, change everything, everybody would agree with him, and he would rule as sort of the autocrat. Yeah.
I think in general rulers find out over time that being less personalist is more valuable to them. So you gave us sort of some broad thought guidelines for the European Union. I wonder if you'd like to give us any tactical closing advice to the European Union.
There are several historians here, and I imagine when you're asked for things like tactical advice or what's going to happen in the future, like next week.
This is what all historians despise and loathe and
we
live
know
in.
we're tempted.
Yeah, I know. And I'm trying to tempt you a little more.
I know. My advisor...
Well, there's another dessert waiting for you.
Oh, okay. Well, in that case. No, my doctoral supervisor, István Deák, a wonderful man, told me never predict anything because in 1968 he had been asked on national television in the United States, will the Soviet Union invade Czechoslovakia? And he said, absolutely no, it will never happen. So, and he's a really bright guy. But I would say tactically what the lesson I learned, but it's not a strategy. I can't tell the EU how to do this. But when asked, I have always said, local people have to understand how to engage with these institutions and why these institutions matter to them. And they do. And they should. And maybe in COVID it's a little bit clearer. But my understanding is, and this was so evident in Brexit, that no one understood. And I mean, you all know this from reading the newspaper, right? Yeah. Nobody understood what the EU really did for them. The EU is a bunch of difficult rules and regulations from Brussels that are always limiting our ability to act. And I was the head of department and had to follow those rules, and it was horrible. But all these amazing things that it does, and my own institution, which brings, Europeans together in a real European sense, it's very exciting and it's very important. And people need to be aware. They need to take themselves initiative from below to engage with these institutions. And if you want to fix it.
Yeah, right. Well, great advice. Engage from below. That. Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I just don't know how many politicians can envision that. And telling the good burgher to engage from below is a really challenging political solution. But you're a historian, and that is a good thing. And it makes life easier, certainly for you. And but I think that the perspective on the empire is remarkable. For our next conversation, I want to hear about other empires and how they might compare. Anthony Pagden, for example, has written about them. But I think we're out of time for now. And I just want to thank you for a fantastic talk. And we hope that as your thinking develops more, you'll come back and present it in successive iterations.
Thank you.
And I just want to say that our next event is tomorrow night at 7:30 p.m. Central European Time, when we'll talk to economic historian Adam Tooze about the absolutely immediate present in his new book, Shut Down, How COVID Shook the World. And we look forward to seeing you then. And until then, goodbye.